What if I told you the most powerful volcanic eruption of the 20th century is one almost nobody can name? Not Krakatoa, not Mount St. Helens, not Pinatubo. I'm talking about a disaster that happened in Alaska in 1912. In just 60 hours, the ground ripped open and blasted around 15 cubic kilometers of magma into the sky. The ash column rose nearly 30 kilometers high. That is about 3 times higher than Mount Everest. And then, the darkness came. Not just a little haze, not just a smoky sunset, real darkness. The kind of darkness where people could not see their own hands in front of their faces. Ash drifted across oceans. The sky changed color, thousands of miles away. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped. Crops failed in places far from Alaska. People saw blood-red sunsets and had no idea what caused them. And yet today, the name Novarupta means almost nothing to most people. That is the part that bothers me. Because this was not a small event. This was not some local eruption that only affected a few empty miles of wilderness. This was a planet-scale warning. It changed the sky. It touched the climate. It buried villages. It fooled scientists for decades. But somehow, it slipped out of memory. Ask people about Pompeii, and they know the story. Ask about Krakatoa, and many have heard the name. Ask about Tambora, and some will remember the year without a summer. But Novarupta? Silence. And maybe that silence is the most disturbing part of all. Because this eruption did not happen in ancient history. It happened in the modern age. Newspapers existed, scientists existed, governments existed, and still, one of the largest eruptions humanity had ever witnessed was pushed into the margins like a footnote no one wanted to read. For 41 years, even the official story pointed to the wrong volcano. Textbooks blamed Mount Katmai. Scientists repeated it. The public accepted it. But Katmai was not the true source. The real source was sitting about 10 kilometers away, a small, almost forgettable dome called Novarupta. A disaster that shook the atmosphere was hiding behind the wrong name. So the real question is not just, what happened in Alaska in 1912? The real question is this: how can a catastrophe powerful enough to disturb the climate of half the planet become almost forgotten? How can something so massive be buried so quietly? And if a disaster like Novarupta can vanish from public memory in only one human lifetime, then what else have we already forgotten? That is where this story begins. Not with a famous mountain, not with a city frozen in ash, but with a hole in the ground, a sky turning black, and a warning from Earth that almost no one remembers. Alaska is the kind of place where the Earth can move, break, and burn without the rest of the world noticing right away. That is what made the 1912 eruption so terrifying. It did not begin in front of a crowd. There were no tourists standing with cameras, no reporters, no live updates, no warning system flashing red, no scientist watching a screen and saying, "Something is coming." There was only a remote stretch of the Alaska Peninsula, far from major cities, far from help, and far from anyone who could truly understand what was starting beneath the ground. And the strangest part is this: it was not a famous mountain blowing its top in a way people could easily point to. It was not like the images most of us have in our heads, where a tall volcano explodes, fire shoots into the sky, and everyone knows exactly where the danger is coming from. This was different. This was a hole. A new opening tore through the ground in a lonely part of southwest Alaska. At first, it had no famous name, no history that people talked about, no clear warning signs that anyone had recorded, no long trail of earthquakes that made people pay attention. For the first several hours, there were no real witnesses at all. Think about that. One of the biggest eruptions of the modern world had already begun, and almost no one knew where it was happening. The planet was screaming, but there was barely anyone close enough to hear it clearly. By the time people finally looked toward the sky, the event was already far beyond their control. Ash had already climbed high into the atmosphere. The plume was punching upward faster than anyone on the ground could understand. The sky began to disappear. The air changed. The light changed. The world started to feel wrong. And that is what makes this story so unsettling. Nature does not need an audience. It does not wait for roads, cities, instruments, or witnesses. It does not care if humans are ready to measure it. It does not care if anyone is watching. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing on Earth happens in the quietest place. A place with no alarms, no cameras, no one taking notes. Just a hidden pressure building underground until, suddenly, the land opens. And by then, the first chapter of the disaster has already been written. That is exactly what happened in Alaska in 1912. Before the world had a name for it, before science had the right answer, before anyone could even explain what they were seeing, the eruption had already taken control of the sky. Then came Kodiak Island. About 100 miles east of the eruption, people there were not standing near the volcano. They were not watching a mountain explode. Most of them had no idea what was happening, and that almost makes it worse. On June 7th, the sky over Kodiak began to change in the middle of the day. At first, it may have looked like a strange storm moving in. The light faded. The air grew heavy. Then the darkness deepened. By mid-afternoon, the sun was gone. Not hidden behind clouds. Gone. By evening, every lamp in town had to be lit, but even that did not help for long. Ash was falling so thick that light could barely cut through it. It came down like wet gray snow, covering roofs, streets, boats, windows, and anything left outside. People tried to move from one building to another, but even a short walk became dangerous. Ash filled their boots. It got into their mouths. It scratched their throats. To breathe, they had to press wet cloths over their faces. Imagine standing in your own town and suddenly not trusting the air. By midnight, ash was falling at a frightening pace. Roofs started to groan under the weight. Some collapsed. Animals died in the streets. The harbor turned strange and heavy as ash piled onto the water until it no longer looked like water at all. For 2.5 days, Kodiak was trapped in darkness. Not a gloomy afternoon kind of darkness. Real darkness. The kind where a lantern held at arm's length could disappear in front of you. The kind where people could hear the world falling apart around them, but could not see where the danger was coming from. That is hard to sit with, because when we think of disaster, we usually imagine people seeing the thing that is coming for them. A wave, a fire, a storm cloud, a mountain exploding on the horizon. But the people of Kodiak did not get that. They did not see the volcano. They saw the sky vanish. They saw ash bury their homes. They heard roofs strain, animals panic, people cough, and the town slowly disappear under a gray weight they could not stop. The United States revenue cutter Manning was anchored in the harbor, and its crew became a lifeline. Captain Perry brought residents aboard. He ordered the hatches sealed. Crewmen worked with shovels on the decks, fighting to keep the ship from being buried under the falling ash. Think about that image for a second. A ship meant to float on water, nearly threatened by dust from the sky. When the ash finally stopped, Kodiak was covered in about 1/2 meter of gray debris. Buildings had been damaged or crushed. The town would spend years clearing it away. The eruption itself had happened far away, but Kodiak had lived through the darkness it created. And the most frightening part is still this. They never truly saw the volcano. They only saw their world disappear in front of them. While Kodiak was fighting through darkness, other places were disappearing in a quieter way. Katmai, Savanoski, Douglas. These were not just names on a map. People lived there. Families had homes there. There were routines, paths, small buildings, voices, work, meals, memories. The kind of ordinary life that never feels important until it is gone. Then, in one weekend, everything changed. The eruption did not just cover the land with ash, it broke the future of those settlements. People fled. Some never came back. The villages were abandoned within hours, and they were never rebuilt. That is a hard thing to imagine. A place can survive storms. It can survive hard winters. It can survive hunger, isolation, and fear. But sometimes one disaster comes through and cuts the line completely. One day, there is a village. A few days later, there is only ash, silence, and a name people will slowly stop saying. No busy streets, no smoke from homes, no children running outside, no one repairing the roofs and saying, "We'll get through this." Just empty ground. And maybe that is one reason Nova Rupta feels so unsettling. It did not leave behind a famous ruined city like Pompeii. It did not give the world one clear image to remember. It erased smaller places, remote places, communities far from the center of attention. And when small places disappear, the world often moves on too quickly. For the people who lived there, this was not a footnote. It was the end of home, the end of everything familiar, the end of a place their families may have expected to return to, season after season, year after year. But after 1912, those villages became memories. And memory, when no one keeps repeating it, can fade almost as fast as footprints under falling ash. A few years later, scientists finally reached the eruption zone. By then, the worst was already over. The ash had settled, the sky was clear again, the immediate fear had passed. But the land was still holding the truth, and that truth was not easy to read. In 1915, an expedition arrived, led by Robert F. Griggs from Ohio State University. He was not there to solve a volcanic mystery at first. He was a botanist. His job was to study how plants came back after a disaster. But once he stepped into that landscape, the story became much bigger than plants. In 1916, Griggs climbed Mount Katmai, and what he found looked like the answer everyone had been waiting for. Katmai's summit was gone. Where the top of the mountain should have been, there was a massive caldera, a huge collapsed hole, miles across, nearly a kilometer deep, the kind of scar that makes you think, yes, this must be it. So, the conclusion seemed obvious. Katmai had exploded. Katmai had thrown all that ash into the sky. Katmai was the volcano that buried Kodiak and changed the skies across the northern hemisphere. For a while, that explanation made sense. The mountain looked guilty, but then came the numbers, and the numbers did not behave. Griggs measured how much material seemed to be missing from Katmai's summit. The estimate came out to about 1 cubic kilometer. That sounds like a lot, but the eruption had produced around 15 cubic kilometers of material. That is not a small mismatch. That is not a rounding error. That is not the kind of thing you shrug off and say, close enough. It was off by a factor of 15. So now, there was a problem. If Katmai only lost about 1 cubic kilometer, where did the other 14 cubic kilometers come from? That question should have stopped the story cold. But it did not. For years, the simplest answer kept winning. Katmai had the giant crater. Katmai looked destroyed. Katmai was the obvious suspect, so Katmai got blamed. Textbooks repeated it. Reports repeated it. People accepted it. And the real source of the eruption stayed almost invisible, sitting about 10 kilometers away, quiet and easy to overlook. That is what makes this part of the story so frustrating. Science is supposed to follow the evidence. But sometimes, even smart people get pulled toward the thing that looks most dramatic. The collapsed mountain looked like the crime scene, so everyone focused on it. But the Earth had left a clue in plain sight. The math did not match. And when the math does not match, the story is not finished. Katmai may have looked like the volcano that erupted, but the missing 14 cubic kilometers were telling a different story. Then, Griggs saw something that did not look like it belonged on Earth. West of Katmai, beyond the collapsed mountain everyone had been blaming, there was a wide valley, more than 20 kilometers long, several kilometers across. And instead of trees, streams, grass, or animals, the whole place was covered in a flat, gray layer. It looked dead, but it was not quiet. Steam was rising everywhere, not from one crack, not from a few hot spots, from thousands of vents across the valley floor. Some were small, some were violent. Some sent white columns of steam high into the air. Griggs called it the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, and even that name may have been too small. Later surveys suggested there may have been far more vents than that, maybe closer to 100,000 at the beginning. Imagine standing on the edge of a valley and seeing the ground breathing in every direction. That is the kind of sight that stays with a person. The air shimmered with heat. The ground was still hot through the soles of a boot. In some places, water poured on the rocks would boil. Some vents reached temperatures around 645 degrees Celsius. That is hotter than most people can even picture. Hot enough to burn through what your mind thinks of as normal ground. Hot enough to make the land feel less like land and more like the surface of another planet. But here is the important part. This was not lava. That is what most people would assume. A volcano erupts, so the valley must have been covered by lava, right? No. What buried this place was something much more sudden and, in many ways, more terrifying. A pyroclastic flow. A superheated rush of gas, ash, and pumice that came racing down the valley during the first hours of the eruption. It moved fast. It carried heat no living thing could survive. It did not roll gently across the land. It swallowed it. The old valley disappeared under deposits that were hundreds of meters thick in places. More than 120 square kilometers were covered. Everything underneath was sterilized. Plants, soil, animal life, all gone. The living surface was replaced by a smooth, gray wasteland that was still cooling years later. And that is what the early reports missed. People on Kodiak saw darkness. They saw ash. They saw their town vanish under gray dust. But they never saw this. No one saw the first hours clearly. No one watched the pyroclastic flow race through that valley. By the time scientists arrived, the violence was already frozen into the ground. That is what makes the Valley of 10,000 Smokes so powerful as a clue. It proved that the real disaster was not only in the sky. It was not only the ash that fell on towns far away. The deeper story was under the ash. The valley itself had been remade. And if you looked closely, it was telling everyone the same thing. The source of this eruption had to be somewhere nearby. Not just on the mountain, everyone was blaming. Somewhere inside or near that smoking valley. And then there was Nova Rupta. At first glance, it did not look like much. That is the strange part. After everything that happened, the darkened skies, the ash, the buried towns, the smoking valley, you would expect the true source to look massive. You would expect a giant, broken mountain, a terrifying crater, something obvious, something that screams, "I did this." But Nova Rupta was not like that. It was small. Just a gray dome sitting in the valley, only a few hundred meters across, and not very tall. Compared to the collapsed summit of Katmai, it looked almost harmless. More like a bump on the landscape than the mouth of a disaster. And because it looked so small, people did what people often do. They looked past it. Griggs had walked near it. He noticed it, but he did not treat it as the main answer. At the time, that made sense. Why would anyone blame a small dome when a huge mountain nearby had collapsed into a giant caldera? Katmai looked guilty. Nova Rupta looked like a leftover detail, but that little dome was holding the real secret. It was the place where the eruption had actually broken through. The thing everyone had overlooked was not a side note. It was the source. That is what makes this part of the story so powerful. The biggest clue was not hiding because it was invisible. It was hiding because it looked too small to matter. And that happens more often than we like to admit. People chase the dramatic thing, the loud thing, the huge scar on the skyline. We trust what looks obvious. We assume size equals importance. But the Earth does not work that way. Sometimes the most dangerous pressure finds a quiet path. Sometimes the real break happens off to the side. Sometimes the thing that changes everything is sitting in plain sight, looking too ordinary for anyone to fear. Nova Rupta was like that, a small dome in a remote Alaskan valley, easy to miss, easy to dismiss, easy to leave out of the story. And yet, it was tied to one of the most powerful eruptions in recorded history. That is the lesson that stays with me. Sometimes, disaster is not sitting in the biggest thing in front of us. Sometimes it is sitting in the thing so small that nobody bothers to look twice. Then, more than 4 decades after the eruption, someone finally pulled the story apart. His name was Garnis Curtis. In 1953, Curtis came to the Valley of 10,000 Smokes as a geologist from the University of California, Berkeley. By that time, the valley was not as wild as it had been when Griggs first saw it. Many of the steam vents had weakened. The ground had cooled. The danger was lower. So now, real fieldwork was possible. Curtis was not there to make a dramatic accusation. He was not trying to embarrass anyone. He was doing the quiet work that science often depends on. He collected samples: rock, ash, pumice, pieces of the eruption left behind in the valley. Then he started reading the evidence. And the evidence did not support the old story. The pumice was not all the same. It came in different types. Curtis found rhyolite, dacite, and andesite. 3 different kinds of magma, all tied to the same eruption. That mattered. Because this was not what people expected from one simple volcanic source, the chemistry was saying the system was more complicated. The eruption had not behaved like a single mountain simply blowing itself apart. So Curtis kept going. He mapped where the materials had fallen. He studied the thickness of the deposits. He looked at the direction the pumice and ash had spread. And when the patterns came together, the answer was clear. The eruption did not come from Mount Katmai. It came from Novarupta. That small gray dome people had treated like a minor detail was the real mouth of the disaster. For 41 years, the world had been calling the catastrophe by the wrong name. That should make us pause, because it was not just a tiny mistake in a label. The whole public story had been built around the wrong volcano. Katmai looked destroyed, so people blamed Katmai. Textbooks repeated it. Reports repeated it. The mistake became normal. But Katmai had not exploded. Katmai had collapsed. And there is a big difference. What Curtis showed was that magma beneath Katmai had been drained away through an underground pathway, roughly 10 kilometers long, toward Novarupta. The pressure moved sideways under the land. The eruption broke out at Novarupta, while Katmai was emptied from below. Then, Katmai's summit fell in. That process is now called magma piracy. It is a strange name, but it fits. One volcanic system steals magma from another part of the system, and the mountain people blame is not the one that actually erupts. Katmai was not the gun. It was the body left behind. Novarupta was the source. And once you understand that, the whole story changes. The massive caldera at Katmai was not proof that Katmai had erupted. It was proof that something beneath it had been taken away. The real disaster had opened up off to the side, through a small dome most people barely noticed. So after 41 years, the truth finally came out. Not because it was obvious, but because someone stopped trusting the obvious and followed the evidence instead. So why did the world forget Novarupta? That is the uncomfortable part. Because the eruption was not small. It was not quiet in any natural sense. It threw ash across huge distances. It changed the sky. It affected temperatures across the northern hemisphere. It buried land, emptied villages, and confused science for decades. But history does not always remember the biggest disaster. It remembers the disaster people can see. Krakatoa is remembered because it killed tens of thousands of people. Tambora is remembered because it helped create the year without a summer and brought famine into the story. Vesuvius is remembered because Pompeii gave the world a frozen city, a human tragedy carved into ash and stone. Pinatubo is remembered because it happened in front of modern cameras, modern instruments, and a watching world. Novarupta had almost none of that. It happened in a remote corner of Alaska, far from the center of public attention. There were no news cameras, no dramatic photographs spreading around the world in real time, no famous city buried in a way people could visit later and point to. And officially, the death toll stayed near 0. That matters more than people like to admit. Because when a catastrophe has no clear body count, the modern world often treats it like it was somehow less real, less tragic, less important. But that is not fair. People lost homes. Villages were abandoned. Families were displaced. The land was changed. The sky was changed. The climate felt it. But because the human loss was not counted in a simple, unforgettable number, the story slipped away. And the timing made it even easier to forget. The Titanic had gone down just weeks earlier. The Mexican Revolution was already shaking headlines. Europe was moving closer to war. Within 2 years, World War I would consume the world's attention. A volcano in remote Alaska could not compete with that. So the story faded, first from the front pages, then from public conversation, then from memory. And that says something about us. We do not always remember disasters by how powerful they were. We remember them by how many people were watching. We remember the images, the names, the ruins, the death tolls, the stories that can be repeated in one sentence. Novarupta was harder to package. It had no famous city. No single photograph burned into public memory. No simple villain. No clear graveyard. Just a massive eruption in a remote place, with consequences too large to ignore but too distant for most people to feel. And maybe that is the real warning. A disaster does not need an audience to matter. It does not become less dangerous because fewer people saw it. Novarupta was forgotten not because it was small, but because it happened where the world was not looking. And here is the part we should be careful with. Alaska did not go quiet after 1912. The Alaska Peninsula is still one of the most active volcanic regions on Earth. It has dozens of active volcanoes spread across a long, remote chain of land and ocean. Most eruptions there are much smaller than Novarupta. Most do not change the climate. Most do not bury valleys or darken towns for days. But the system is still alive. That matters. Today, the monitoring is far better than it was a century ago. Scientists have seismometers, satellites, gas sensors, instruments that can detect heat, ground movement, and other signs that something may be changing below the surface. So, this is not 1912 anymore. We are not completely blind. But that does not mean we should feel too comfortable, because Novarupta itself gave very little warning. There were some earthquakes before the eruption, but not years of obvious signals. Not a long, dramatic buildup that made everyone stop and prepare. The serious warning signs came only shortly before the eruption began. That is what makes this story feel so uneasy. The land can be quiet for a long time and still not be finished. According to the story, the magma system beneath Katmai is slowly refilling. That does not mean another giant eruption is about to happen. It does not mean people should panic. There is no clear emergency signal here. But it does mean the region is not dead. And that is the lesson. Silence is not the same as safety. A volcano can look calm. A valley can look empty. A crater lake can sit still under a dark sky. And deep below, the system can still be changing at a pace humans barely notice. That is the hard thing about geology. It does not move on our schedule. It can wait longer than any lifetime. It can stay quiet through generations. Then, when pressure finally finds a path, everything changes fast. Novarupta reminds us that modern instruments matter, but humility matters too. We can measure more than people could in 1912. We can warn earlier. We can understand the land better. But we should never mistake a quiet landscape for a harmless one. Alaska still has a voice. Most days, it speaks softly. The danger is forgetting that it can still roar. In the end, Novarupta leaves us with a hard truth. Geology does not care if anyone is watching. The Earth does not wait for cameras. It does not wait for newspapers. It does not wait for people to understand what is happening. Pressure builds, rock breaks, magma moves, and when the time comes, the planet does what it has always done. That is what happened in Alaska in 1912. A disaster powerful enough to change the sky tore open in a remote place. It sent ash high into the atmosphere. It darkened towns. It helped cool part of the northern hemisphere. It erased villages. It fooled scientists for decades. And then, somehow, the world almost forgot it. That may be the most haunting part of the whole story. Not just the eruption, not just the darkness, not even the fact that the wrong volcano was blamed for 41 years. The haunting part is that something this large could happen, leave scars across the land and atmosphere, and still become a quiet paragraph most people never read. Novarupta reminds us that history does not always remember what mattered most. Sometimes it remembers what had the biggest audience. Sometimes it remembers the disaster with the clearest picture, the highest death toll, or the easiest story to tell. But the Earth keeps its own record. It keeps it in ash layers, in collapsed mountains, in silent valleys, in places that look peaceful now, even though they once held the sound of the world breaking open. And that is why stories like this matter. Because some warnings are not loud anymore. Some have already cooled. Some are buried under time, dust, and bad memory, but they are still warnings. If you want to hear more stories about forgotten catastrophes, hidden warnings, and the disasters history pushed aside, subscribe to and turn on notifications. Because not every warning is written clearly in a textbook. Some are still buried under our feet.